You probably have never heard of Alisa Nova, but for millions of people living in ex-Soviet states and throughout the Soviet diaspora, she serves as a symbol for a beautiful future that once felt inevitable. A future where humanity outgrew war, money, and greed, where science and curiosity replaced competition, where kids could genuinely believe they would grow up to build something better than the world they inherited. She also represents the collapse of that future, a world that turned out to be cruel, a society riddled with cracks, a collective failure to build the utopia everyone thought was just around the corner. Created by Kir Bolichov in the mid 1960s, Alisa's Adventures is a children's sci fi series set in the late 21st century, spanning dozens of books, short stories, and several iconic film adaptations. It's hard to think of another Soviet series that comes anywhere close to the fame, legacy, and cultural impact that it had. My mom grew up with Alisa, I grew up with Alisa, and if I ever had kids, they grow up with Alisa too. Today, I want to take you inside and behind the world of Alisa's adventures to show you what it promised, what it became, and what it continues to mean to the people who believed in it. We have a long road ahead of us, so we might as well get started. I take you now to the late 21st century. The future presented in Alisa's adventures is quite utopian. Most menial work has been automated, all diseases, with the exception of the common cold, have been wiped out, and all environmental damage has been fixed. Lightspeed ships explore outer space, and friendly aliens can be found around every corner, with most of the galaxy joined by a galactic union. Money no longer exists in most of the galaxy. Neither do states, governments, or social classes. The concept of war has long been abandoned. Pretty much everything one could ever need is easily available, free of charge. It is no longer to each according to their need, but to each according to their desire. For example, free ice cream machines line the streets of Moscow, offering exciting flavors ranging from chocolate to strawberry to pineapple mint. Of course, if you have too many servings on a cold day, the machine might just refuse to give you any more, offering hot tea instead. People do still work. Actually, they work a lot. But it is no longer for personal gain or profit. Instead, people are motivated by the pursuit of science, seeking to make the world a better place, reach new heights of understanding, and make what once seemed impossible possible. The people of the future are better in every conceivable way. They're kinder, braver, smarter, and more athletic. The average future fifth grader can beat a modern Olympian in a pole vault and a modern grandmaster in a game of chess. To quote one of the books, in the future there are no longer ordinary people. 5 billion exceptional, famous, talented people will inhabit the earth. One of those exceptional, famous, talented people, maybe even more exceptional, famous, and talented than the rest, is our main character, Alisa Selezneva. Alisa is a young girl, around 11 or 12 for most of the series. She's very daring and extremely confident, never afraid to sneak off in search of new adventures. At the same time, she's also exceptionally intelligent and perceptive, constantly solving problems that stump even the adults in her life. That being said, she's actually not the best student. Her desire for adventure is usually much stronger than her desire to do homework, and her natural intelligence makes her doubt the value of a standardized education. Of course, though, she is deeply scientific and has, from a very young age, dedicated her life to biology. It's a subject that she feels very passionate about thanks to her love of animals and to her dad, Professor Seleznov, the head of the Moscow Cosmo Zoo. Alisa and her dad venture out into space in search of new animals to study and bring home. Some of the most iconic creatures they meet along the way include the chatterbirds, who can fly across open space and perfectly recreate any sounds they hear, the horned dog-like creatures whose front half always lives a day ahead in time from the back half, and my absolute favorites, indicators, small box-like creatures with spindly legs that change their color depending on their mood. An honorable mention does have to go to the humble Martian praying mantis, Alisa's faithful pet throughout the series. There's a lot of great ones though. When she's not out with her dad on those missions or off on her own being a space delinquent, you can usually find Alisa at the Young Biologist Lab, a very fascinating place where kids as young as 6 are allowed to just go wild and do whatever kinds of experiments they want, be it bioengineering trees that grow bagels, crossing mosquitoes with geese, or traveling back in time to see the exact moment that monkeys turned into humans. Oh yeah, time travel is very much a thing in this universe. In fact, there are almost as many Alisa stories about traveling in time as there are about traveling in space. Alisa and her friends travel to all sorts of times: the 1970s, the 1200s, dinosaur times, the era of legends. The era of legends, not to be confused with the League of Legends, is one of the most fascinating pieces of Alisa lore. Apparently, around 30,000 years ago, right before the last glacial maximum, there was a period of time when fairy tale creatures really did inhabit the Earth. It's mostly Russian fairy tale creatures that you probably don't really know, so I'm not gonna get super deep into it. But we do also see gnomes and genies and the Minotaur, and many other characters from culture-specific myths, despite the fact that none of those cultures would exist for tens of thousands of years to come. And a great example of the labor-oriented values this series is absolutely soaked with, all the fairy tale creatures died out when the glacial period hit because they didn't understand the value of hard work. Let me find the quote. Fairy tale creatures, no matter how smart they were, did not know how to work. All of their fairy tale castles, magic carpets, and other wonders were made with sorcery, and so, naturally, could not provide any benefit once it got cold. Do you know how it is with wizards? They can build a palace or even a castle. Everything in it will be just like in a real castle, even the metal gates. But wizards don't know how to create a heating system and have no clue how to caulk a window to keep out a draft. Yeah, Bulachov goes on a rant about this pretty much every time the era is brought up. Anyways. While traveling through time, Alisa and her friends meet all sorts of historic figures, real and imaginary, often at the same time. For example, it turns out that Joan of Arc not only survived her supposed burning, but also went on to marry Robin Hood. In another story, one of Alisa's friends, who finds himself stuck in the deep past, is rescued by an 80,000-year-old alien, who turns out to be both Captain Nemo from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Noah from the Bible, you know, of Noah's Ark fame. So there we have it, a high-tech communist utopia full of mysteries and adventure, but largely inhabited by kind, caring people. A world where interpersonal conflict and violence are on their way out of the mainstream and social hierarchies no longer have a place. Except that isn't actually the world of Alisa Series Nova, but merely a world. The books about Alisa were written over a period of almost 40 years, from the mid-60s to the early 2000s. In that time, the world that Kir Bulachov lived in was flipped on its head. Pretty much nothing stayed the same. Not daily life, not the economic system, not even the name of the country he lived in. Slowly but surely, those changes made their ways into the books, until Alisa's world was so unrecognizable that fans started to think of the series as taking place across a series of parallel worlds, united only by the characters who live in them. There's a post on one of the surviving fan sites that lays out this theory. The main difference it talks about is the contrast between the early books, which paint the image of a communist utopia, and the later books, which start to show quote-unquote clear attributes of capitalism, such as terrorism and the drug trade. Their words, not mine. At some point in the series, money is reintroduced to the world. All of a sudden, instead of taking access to supplies for granted, Alisa grabs her wallet and stops by the store to stock up on Pepsi before embarking on a long space trip. Interestingly, there are still free ice cream machines. That detail never changes. In fact, I think humanity's love for ice cream is one of the most consistent aspects of the series. Throughout the books, Alisa eats 58 servings of ice cream. Countries are suddenly back too, as are governments and politicians. The Galactic Union disappears and is replaced with the Galactic Interpol, which unites the galaxy not through education and diplomacy, but through strict, punitive enforcement of laws. Alisa also becomes really famous. Books and movies about her adventures start appearing within the world. At first, details about who wrote them and why are rather vague, but eventually the in-world credit goes to Kir Bulachov, the real-life author of the books. At one point, one of Alisa's long-term nemesis, the space pirate Happy Guy Ooh, straight up refuses to harm her, asking, "If I killed you, what would Kir Bulachov write books about?" My personal theory is that Bulachov got to actually visit the future and was allowed to write books about Alisa's adventures as long as he only published them in the future. Alas, he disobeyed and started publishing them in the past, permanently changing the future and single-handedly causing the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fame definitely goes to Alisa's head. She starts comparing herself to Christopher Columbus anytime she's stuck at home without an adventure lined up, and gets impatient with people who don't immediately recognize her. On top of those huge vibe changes, the books also just become really inconsistent. Alisa's birth date keeps flipping between 2070 and 2080. The way established technologies work changes at the drop of a hat. Sometimes magic exists and sometimes it doesn't. Whatever is the most convenient for the plot at any given moment becomes the new canon. There are also plot lines that keep getting repeated again and again with no acknowledgement that they already happened. 3 separate times, Alisa ends up on a planet where the locals have an ability to shapeshift. Each time, some random girl falls in love with one of Alisa's friends and uses shapeshifting to pretend to be someone close to him. Each time, they act like it's the first time it happened. It's honestly pretty confusing. How could such a beloved author, writing such an iconic series, have such little regard for the world he created? Well, there are actually quite a few reasons. But to truly understand what they are, we're gonna have to look behind the scenes. It's time to look at the man himself, the humble historian who never meant to be an author, yet ended up creating one of the most iconic Russian characters of all time, Kir Bulichov. Kir Bulichov, I'm gonna keep on learning about Kir Bulichov. I'm gonna keep on talking about Kir Bulichov. Kir Bulichov. Kir Bulichov was not born on October 18th, 1934, but Igor Всеволодovich Mazheko was. Actually, I can't pronounce Igor properly, but it's okay because neither could he. We have the same speech impediment. Mazheko never set out to be an author. The way he put it, it was merely the inevitable outcome of the circumstances he found himself in. You see, from before he was even born, his life was defined by chaos and happenstance. In his memoirs, he wrote that if it hadn't been for the revolution, he wouldn't have ever been born, but he would have gotten to meet his grandparents. The formative years of his childhood were spent in the shadow of World War II. After evacuating from Moscow in 1941, his family came close to death time and time again, whether at the hands of famine, chance, or paranoid wartime bureaucracy. Each time, survival seemed like an accident. His stepdad, who he was very close with, did die on the last day of the war, after Germany had signed a surrender. Back home after the war, Mazheko fell in love with painting. He went to art school but got very sick and had to miss almost a whole year. His class moved on without him. It was during his sickness, though, that Majeko started reading a lot and fell in love with science fiction. But for now, becoming an author was still nowhere on his mind. Instead, with his art dream shattered, he decided to pursue paleontology. Alas, the government had different plans for him. At the behest of his school's leadership, he was sent to the Institute of Foreign Languages, as part of what was meant to be an international spy training program for the KGB. He was a great student and quickly mastered English. However, right as he was about to finish his studies, Stalin died and the KGB decided it was all set on spies. Instead, as one of the only people in his program who was married by that point, he was sent to serve as a translator at a Soviet funded construction site in Myanmar. Married people were seen to pose a much smaller flight risk as they had someone waiting for them at home. In Myanmar, Mojeko got to witness the peak absurdity of life, both under British imperialism and under Soviet bureaucracy. He saw the social climate shift day by day and hour by hour as petty politics played out in real time. He watched party leaders jail loyal workers for planning to defect before defecting themselves days later. Every day felt like a brand new reality. And so, by his late 20s, Majeko had lost count of how many times he had seen societal structures be built and then crumble around him. But through all of it, he saw humanity persevere. He remembered the war refugees sharing food and telling each other stories, the nights sneaking out to smoke cigarettes with his friends at the sanitarium while he was sick, the evenings spent with his sister and their friends writing silly poetry in a large storage closet, the days spent at the little bookshop in Myanmar, and the conversations he'd have with the Englishman who ran it over endless cups of coffee. All of those moments felt so much more real and mattered so much more than the chaos that surrounded them. After returning to Moscow, Majeko joined the Institute of Asian Studies to pursue a master's degree in Southeast Asian history, which he had fallen in love with during his time in Myanmar. He also started writing cultural study essays for a journal called Around the World, which focused on, you can probably guess. Shortly afterwards, the journal also started releasing issues focused on foreign fiction, and Majeko got hired on as a translator, while also continuing his research work at the Institute. Suddenly, all of the pieces were in place for Kir Bulichov to be born. A love for science fiction, close proximity to the publishing world, a deep awareness of the absurdity of life, and an even deeper love for the people who were alive with him. Is it any wonder that he became an author? There's a story Majeko left to tell about the moment he became Kir Bulichov. The year was 1967, and the editorial team of Around the World was trying to combat on the job drinking. They did so by buying a ton of alcohol and locking it in a cabinet right in the middle of the office. That way, anytime someone would want to drink, they'd have to overcome a feeling of shame and do it in front of everyone. Apparently, that was working surprisingly well until one day. A translated story slated for the next issue of the journal was pulled last minute by the censure board. Unfortunately, 200,000 copies of the cover of the issue had already been printed, featuring an illustration for that exact story. Panicked and certain they were about to lose their bonuses, the team decided to go ahead and open up that locked cabinet. Everyone got properly drunk, and someone came up with a plan. What if each one of them tried their hand at writing their own story to match the printed cover? Everyone thought it was a great idea, agreed to do it, then promptly went home and passed out. Majeko was one of the only people who actually wrote something. And so, mostly due to the lack of competition, his story was chosen. With less than an hour until it went to print, he freaked out about the idea of putting his name on it, worried that it would make his coworkers at the institute take him less seriously.
На овощную базу не поехал, к товарищу Иванову отнесся не по-товарищески, собрание прогулял профсоюзно и еще пишет фантастику, гнать такого.
Forced to quickly come up with a pseudonym, his mind immediately went to two of the most important women in his life: his wife, Kira, and his mom, whose maiden name had been Bolichova. He combined the two, and so Kir Bolichov came into existence. He loved to tell that story, but as many of the stories he loved to tell, it wasn't entirely true. As I said, this was in 1967, while the very first story credited to Kir Bolichov had been, well, you're about to see. In 1965, Kir Bolichov published the first collection of stories about Alisa, titled A Girl Nothing Bad Will Happen To. That has a much better ring in Russian. The collection is framed as a lighthearted warning from Alisa's dad to her new teacher, right as she's about to enter the first grade. He writes about her mischievous spirit and about all of the adventures she's already had by the age of 6. While those early stories about Alisa are some of the least sophisticated ones in the series, the personal connection he had to the material really shone through. You see, he had been inspired to write them by his own daughter, who was also named Alisa, and who was also about to enter the first grade. The stories really do feel like a dad writing about his daughter. The setting might be fantastical, but the relationships and the emotions were strikingly real. And it's precisely those emotions that made the stories instantly resonate not only with the kids who they were written for, but with their parents as well. And with everyone else who happened to read them. Even I, a 25-year-old with no plans to ever have kids, felt deeply moved when rereading those stories in preparation for this video. And so the cat was out of the bag. Majeka, or should I say Bulichov, started writing science fiction of all kinds, both for kids and for grown-ups. Another early creation of his that I think deserves a mention is Great Guslar, a hilarious satirical series set in a small provincial Russian town. Perfectly normal, if not for the fact that it keeps being visited by aliens and magical creatures. It honestly feels eerily similar to Welcome to Night Vale. Just like the Alisa stories, his other early works stood out instantly due to their lightheartedness, their humor, and the deeply human stories they told. Like other Soviet sci-fi authors of the time, Bolichev wrote about bizarre, futuristic worlds full of space travel and new technology. But unlike his contemporaries, his focus wasn't actually on building those worlds, but rather on populating them with full-fledged, ordinary humans and seeing how they interacted with one another. He had learned, from personal experience and from the study of history, that the worlds and structures we live in are abstract and temporary. It is the people who inhabit them that matter. The future he wrote about served merely as a plot device to elevate ordinary human problems to new heights, and to explore them from new perspectives. He actually never even really considered himself to be a science fiction writer, usually classifying his work as social fantasy.
Вот в этом очевидно смысл фантастики. Говоря о сегодняшнем дне, не писать о будущем, не строить этого будущего. Оно возникает из сегодняшнего дня. Если мы говорим о сегодняшних проблемах, то мы неизбежно уходим на будущее.
However, while that approach made his work resonate with its readers, it did not necessarily make it easier to get published. As Bolichev himself wrote in a historical study of the development of fiction in the Soviet Union, there was an interesting tension between the worlds authors created and the official government narratives on what the future would look like. Even when the books were set in a future that aligned with the government's vision of a communist utopia, the mere fact that they were written by an independent author was often seen as a threat to the government's sole monopoly on defining the path forward. Works of so-called close-aim science fiction that wrote about the very near future and fit neatly within the government's predefined plans were encouraged. Everything else was heavily scrutinized. This was especially the case for works of social fantasy, whose goal was not to assert the existence of a perfect communist future or highlight the upcoming technological advancements that the state would achieve, but to show complicated people existing in that future, still having problems and living their own messy, not perfectly collectivist lives. One publisher even straight up told Bulachov that he sorted social fantasy into two kinds. One went straight to the trash, and the other straight to the KGB. However, those standards were not applied in the same way to media made for kids. Unlike his more serious prose, the stories about Alisa weren't viewed as an actual attempt at establishing a vision of the future, but as an abstract opportunity to teach kids the values that society expected of them while entertaining them along the way. And so, those stories had a lot less trouble getting through the censure. The Kid niche also helped those stories bypass the difficult competition and long waiting lists for getting published. Unlike in the US, where many independent publishers released hundreds, if not thousands, of sci fi and fantasy books every year, the Soviet Union only had a handful of state run publishing houses that only allotted a few slots a year to those genres. All that most authors could hope for was semi regularly publishing short stories and novellas in various newspapers and journals. But even there, the competition was quite stiff. But that competition did not really exist for children's literature, and especially not for sci fi children's literature. Bulachov was pretty much the only person doing that kind of thing. Time and time again, he would come to a publisher with an idea he was very excited for, only to be told that he would have to wait a few years before they'd have any space. But that they would always be happy to go ahead and publish another book or two about Alisa. And so, throughout the 70s, he kept publishing Alisa's adventures, and whenever he could, stories about other stuff. Little by little, he started developing quite a large cult following, and eventually started getting courted by film directors. His popularity really skyrocketed in the 80s, as adaptations of his books started hitting the big screen. First, 1981 saw the release of The Mystery of the Third Planet, a beautiful animated adaptation of one of the early Alisa novels that is still considered to be one of the most iconic Soviet cartoons to this day. A lot of the footage you've seen so far in this video is from it. It was also what finally got his real identity revealed to the public. He won a government award for its script, and his real name was published in the newspaper. Apparently, his fears of such revelation getting him in trouble at the research institute where he still worked almost came true. Upon learning about his secret life as a social fantasy author, his immediate higher-ups feared a scandal and took the case all the way up to the director of the institute. The director simply said, well, does he carry out the plan? Yes, then let him keep carrying it out. That director? None other than Yevgeny Krylatov. Don't worry, that didn't really mean anything to me either, but apparently he was a pretty big deal. Then, in 1985, the TV miniseries Guest from the Future came out and solidified the phenomenon that would come to be known as Alisa Mania, largely in part to Natasha Guseva, who played Alisa. Guseva turned out to be the perfect actress to portray the girl from the future. While she herself did not quite possess the rambunctious spirit that Alisa had in the books, she portrayed her kindness, intellect, and mysterious allure extremely well. There were also actually quite a lot of parallels between Alisa and Guseva's real interests. Not only did Guseva have a pet praying mantis, but she also went on to become a biologist. The show exploded in popularity, with Guseva at its helm. All of the girls wanted to be her, and all of the boys wanted to date her. When I watched the series as a kid, I wanted both. And look where that's gotten me. In the weeks following the release of Guests from the Future, the streets around Guseva's house were literally flooded with boys. Paul Arsenov, the director of the series, and Kir Bulachov both got thousands upon thousands of letters, begging them for Guseva's number, with many boys proclaiming that they were ready to marry her at a moment's notice. Apparently, she did go on to marry one such boy, who was even more persistent than the others. In an interview, she said that he had a CRT TV delivered to her as a gift while hiding inside of it. And first of all, that sounds extremely creepy, but I guess it worked out, so good for them. But second of all, how big was that damn TV? Did she marry a mouse? But it was more than just Guseva that made the series click so strongly. It was the story. I'm not gonna get too deep into it. Actually, I suggest you watch the series yourself. It's available on YouTube with good enough subtitles. But basically, the bulk of Guests from the Future is about Alisa traveling back in time to the 1980s, befriending a bunch of Soviet school kids, and showing them what was waiting for them just around the corner. It perfectly captured the experience of growing up in the era and then expanded it. For the tween and teenagers of the time, it made a bright utopian future seem like something that was actually in their grasp, something they could have a hand in bringing about. As both of the adaptations became cultural phenomena, the demand for more Alisa novels continued to grow. Unfortunately, by this point, Bulgakov had grown somewhat tired of Alisa's adventures, feeling trapped and creatively exhausted by the success of this one character he had created. He wished he could achieve the same level of recognition and demand for his newer work that he felt more passionate about. Time kept passing. Alisa, his daughter, grew up and became less and less like Alisa, the character. His new responsibilities as an author and screenwriter, on top of an already full slate as a historian, put pressure on him and strained his relationship with his family. The personal connection he felt for the world of Alisa started to dwindle. She stopped being a surrogate for his daughter and started to feel like an empty mask he was forced to keep writing about. I'm sure he appreciated the opportunities that he got, but he also felt constrained by his inaccurate reputation as exclusively a kids writer. A few days ago, I was talking to my grandpa about my plans for this video, and he was genuinely surprised that Kir Bulachov wrote more than just kids novels. And it actually made me feel sad. I felt hurt on Bulachov's behalf. Bulachov was the kind of guy who only ever picked up new interests, never dropping his old ones, and so a lack of time became his enemy. In addition to being a prolific fiction author and screenwriter, he never quit his job at the Institute of Asian Studies and published a ton of historical nonfiction, with topics ranging from pirates to Buddhism to everything that happened across the world in the year 1185. He wrote poetry, he loved to paint and to draw caricatures. He kept large collections of various historical objects and somehow became Russia's leading expert on the history of words.
Почему я никогда не стану ни крупным писателем, ни крупным художником, ни крупным ученым? Потому что мне интересно это и это. Это плохо. Жизнь моя проходит, как у мальчика голландского возле плотины. Он вот бегает и спасает страну от наводнения, затыкая дырочки пальчиком. И вот поэтому я, к сожалению, трачу много времени на беготню вдоль плотины.
And as if that wasn't enough, he regularly met with fans and pretty much never turned down an interview. Although he would frequently get impatient when asked questions he thought were stupid or meaningless. Actually, one of his most common responses in interviews was, "Why would you ask me that?" As he wrote on his webpage in the early 2000s, he especially hated conversations about flying saucers, psychics, white, black, green, and blue sorcerers and seers, about the new chronology, about the kindness of Comrade Lenin, or about the predictions of Nostradamus. Also, this isn't related to anything, but it's important for me that you know that on the same webpage, he also described himself as a lesbian. His health started to deteriorate in the 90s, and he became increasingly aware that his time was running out. This knowledge became palpable in his poetry, his essays, and his public appearances. He started talking a lot about death, legacy, and his fear of the unknown. He'd take more active control of interviews, frequently trying to steer the conversation towards what he viewed as the culmination of his life's work, a series of novels called The River Chronos, a long, complex endeavor that blended social fantasy, philosophy, and extremely well-researched alternate history. Tragically, he did not manage to finish the series before his death, and it remains relatively unknown to this day, even in Russia. Through all of that, Alisa was a double-edged sword, consuming a large chunk of his time and keeping him away from the things he actually wanted to work on, while also making it financially feasible for him to pursue those things. It is no coincidence that the years with by far the most Alisa stories written were the years when the Russian economy was doing the worst. First during the perestroika years, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Alisa's adventures started being published in 1965 and reached the height of their popularity in the mid-80s. But almost 2/3 of them were written after 1991. And as you can probably guess, it is those stories, the ones published after the fall of the USSR, where Alisa's world really begins to change. And that's because to Bulachov, it was never actually about the world. It was about the characters living in it. I honestly think that even in the early Alisa stories, he wasn't ever actively trying to paint a communist future, and certainly not to create propaganda. While the future described in those stories seems utopian, the word communism is never actually explicitly mentioned. Neither are the Soviet Union or Lenin or any other hallmarks of the USSR. He revealed in interviews later in life that although he never desired to rebel against them, he hadn't ever been actively loyal to the Communist Party or to any other organization in charge of the country he lived in. Instead, the worlds Bulgachev wrote were an extension of the world he and his readers knew and lived in. In the 1960s, the future was seen as an idealistic communist society with no money, war, governments, or states. In the 1990s, that no longer made sense. But still, why abandon decades of world building and risk confusing long term fans of the series? Well, because he never really expected it to be read as a series in the first place. Even though long form books about Alisa were far easier for him to publish than any other books, most of the works about Alisa still started as standalone stories, published in random journals all across the Soviet Union. It wasn't until just before his death that a comprehensive collection of works about Alisa started getting printed by a single publication. And despite being close with his fans, he always struggled to understand the fact that he actually did have a dedicated fan base that was intent on reading as many of his works as possible. That was never really the audience he had in mind when writing Alisa. Instead, he always just wrote for the next generation of kids, with no expectations that they would ever read any of his earlier works. I think this context also helps explain all of the surface level inconsistencies found throughout Alisa's adventures. The incorrect dates, the ever changing mechanics, the plot repetitions, etc. Those details were never really important to Bulgachev, and there was little external incentive to keep up the continuity. To make matters worse, Bulgachev pretty much never reread previous Alisa stories. Up until his death, he exclusively wrote on a typewriter, usually just typing up a single draft, editing it by hand, and bringing it to the publisher without keeping a copy for himself. And it gets really easy to forget details over the course of 40 years when you're not actively keeping track. Interestingly, it was much easier for him to rewatch adaptations of his work, and he did do that from time to time. Screen canon would frequently replace page canon in later works. Maybe that is why there are still free ice cream machines in the capitalist version of his world. They were featured pretty prominently in Guests from the Future. As for things like terrorism and the drug trade finding their way into the books, well, it's just because he was thinking about both of those things a lot. The wars between Russia and Chechnya made terrorism a leading cause of anxiety for Moscow residents, and he had been assigned to study the history of the Asian drug trade at work. As always, he ended up writing about whatever was on his mind. While we can learn a lot about how the world around him changed from the inconsistencies in his books, I think we can learn more about Bulgachev himself from what stayed the same. Throughout all of the books, both early and later ones, there is a huge emphasis on environmentalism and taking care of the world we live in. That had always been a priority for Bulgachev, who, in his many travels, had seen firsthand the environmental damage that unchecked industrialization can have. He was also a huge animal lover, a trait he directly passed on to Alisa. He had pets throughout all of his life, including a gray cat named Little Mouse, who he had ridden into Alisa's world, and even a pair of miniature lemurs that he had smuggled back from a trip to India and took care of for a few years before deciding to give them away to someone more qualified. He was very kind and gentle, and always made his protagonists lead with kindness. He was very anti-war, and did not believe in justifying aggression with personal affinity. Even in later books, where themes of war and violence became more common, aggression was always condemned, even when it was coming from the side of the supposed good guys.
Мы же в самом деле говорим о том, что мы встретимся с кем-то, прилетят к нам. Мы же даже между собой часто не можем договориться. А когда оказывается, что какой-то очаровательный поэт с далекой планеты выглядит как паук, мы вынимаем пистолет и стараемся попасть между глаз.
He was deeply humorous and satirical, and never afraid to point that humor back at himself. Honestly, as I learned more about him, it made me see the plot lines related to Odysseus' fame in a whole new light. I think he was just trying to poke fun at his own experiences with fame, and at the other famous people he found himself interacting with. Above all, the main theme throughout all of his books about Alisa is that of hard work and responsibility, not only to yourself, but to the world you live in. He truly believed that kids had the capacity to make the future a better place, and took it upon himself to guide and encourage them to do so.
Какое самое главное транспортное средство?
Значит, какое самое главное транспортное средство
Будущее,
в 21 веке? Это будет моноклюидный пентеход. Знаешь, да? Нет? Это же ты изобретешь через 25 лет.
It was those persistent themes, as well as the sheer humanity at the heart of the books and their adaptations, that made it possible for people to feel so connected to the series. And feel connected they did. For the kids growing up in the 80s and 90s, the experience of loving the world of Alisa Siriusnova was simultaneously a deeply personal and a deeply collective one. It was reading the random stories you found in your town's newspaper or in a small bookshop or sometimes even in the bins outside of a paper recycling plant, and then putting the pieces together with the stories your classmates happened to read. It was randomly running into Krylatov and chatting with him for hours, or getting a letter back from him and then starting a fanzine to share what you had learned. It was participating in the collaborative writing competitions he'd occasionally host in nationwide kids' journals, and hoping against all odds that your contribution would be the one picked of the thousands they'd received. It was watching Guests from the Future or Mystery of the Third Planet every time they came on TV, and seeing literally everyone you knew temporarily join you within this magical world that you loved. Alisa Siriznova changed the lives of multiple generations, with hundreds of people citing her as the primary reason they decided to pursue a career in science and started caring about the impact they could have on the future. Statues of Alisa and of her many friends, such as the crowd-favored alien archaeologist Gromazeka, can be found in many cities throughout the ex-Soviet states. The series dramatically increased the popularity of the name Alisa in the Soviet Union, taking it from a relatively obscure name to one of the most popular. And it's the only fandom I know that has a tree alley dedicated to it. Look, I know this video is already quite long, and we're coming up to the end of it, but I promise this is a worthy tangent to go on. In early 2001, a group of fans on a forum called milofon.ru came up with a simple idea. Meet in a Moscow park, plant an alley of oaks dedicated to Alisa Siriznova, and then, of course, throw an epic rager. People loved it. Everyone agreed that it was perfectly in the spirit of the series, a way to directly contribute to the future they wanted to live in. But then, nothing happened. Months passed and fundraising stalled. The spring planting season slipped by with no plan, no date, and no trees in the ground. It was turning into exactly the kind of thing people always say yes to and then never actually do. Until months later, in mid-September, one of the original organizers snapped, posting the following extremely impassioned message. What became of this romantic notion? Exactly what happens when all you get from the people around you is a half-hearted, yeah, let's go for it, and nothing else. Since I was the one who set this whole thing in motion, I intend to see it through to its logical conclusion. In other words, I will plant them, no matter what it takes. I'll dig the soil by moonlight if I have to. I'll buy the oaks one by one, year by year, but I will get this alley planted. And let shame fall upon all of those who merely dream of beauty without ever lifting a finger to create it. There is still time. Let's finally pull it together. I'm counting on you. I'm waiting on you. By the way, a tragic event recently occurred over in America. We are, of course, deeply saddened by it as well, but we simply cannot let the planting season pass us by. Inspired by this passion, people finally came together. On October 6, 2001, 15 or so people showed up to make the alley a reality. They were also joined by Krylatov himself, as well as Natasha Guseva and her daughter, Aleska. There wasn't a grand ceremony or a huge crowd, just a group of people who decided that this one small beautiful thing was worth doing. They worked for a few hours, planting trees and setting a granite stone at the edge of the alley, fitted with a commemorative plaque, and then moved to a nearby club to talk, drink, and reminisce about a series that had changed their lives. The air was thick with determination and friendship, and a deep desire to make the future brighter. Many of the attendees found themselves inspired to write poetry about the event. Instead of oaks, they ended up planting rowan trees, and a tradition was born. Every year to this day, hardcore fans gather the rowan berries and use them to brew homemade rum that they call Alisovka. And so, while Krylatov might no longer be with us, his legacy continues to grow in the heart of Moscow, in a very real and literal sense. Looking back at this series now tends to elicit very complicated emotions from those who grew up with it. Guests from the Future came out in 1985, right at the start of the perestroika. Sure, there were a lot of problems in society, and the economy had long been heading towards a collapse, but it was right before the cracks really started to show. There was still a large social safety net, with no widespread homelessness or unemployment. Violent crimes were relatively rare, and streets felt safe. To the kids and teenagers of the time, who had lived relatively stable lives with clear, guaranteed career progression ahead of them, and who grew up attending well-organized communist youth groups, the utopia portrayed in the miniseries didn't seem like an impossible, abstract future, but rather an achievable goal, something that they would have a hand in building. At the end of the miniseries, right before she travels back to her own time, Alisa tells her new friends what the future holds for each one of them, who becomes a great engineer or a great artist, who goes on to invent time travel. Sure, it feels reassuring, but it also feels like a challenge. Here are the ways that each of you can become extraordinary, making the future extraordinary in the process. But it's not going to be easy. It will only happen if you make it happen. As Alisa bids her goodbye and steps into the time machine, a deeply emotional song starts to play, describing the call of the beautiful afar, beckoning the listener to make their way towards it, but not until they learn to take responsibility and swear to never stop working on being a better person. The song became insanely popular in the Soviet Union, perhaps even more popular than the miniseries itself, as a symbol of the brighter days ahead and all the work it'll take to get there. I don't think I need to tell you that those brighter days did not come to fruition. Only 6 years after the miniseries came out, the Soviet Union collapsed, taking the economy and any remaining social nets down with it. The country entered a dark, violent time from which it has not yet emerged. 40 years down the line from its release, it's hard, even for someone like me who didn't grow up in the Soviet Union and only lived in Russia as a kid, to watch that final scene or to listen to the song without a sharp, painful feeling. The melody no longer seems like an anthem of hope, but rather a requiem for a bright future that we, collectively, failed to build. Every time the song gets posted, the comment section inevitably turns into people waxing poetic about their childhoods and sharing all the ways that their lives haven't quite gone as expected. The most common sentiment that gets expressed is, "We thought the song was about a beautiful future, but all along it was about a beautiful past." But even though the future Alisa's adventures seemed to promise did not materialize, the values that it promoted and the bold, determined kindness of the characters it portrayed still lives within us all. I've translated the song, and my very talented friends have helped me record it. I'm going to play it for you now. I hope it helps convey the feelings that I'm talking about and reminds you that even now, especially now, the future is still in our hands and that it is our responsibility to make it a future we want to live in. Thanks for watching.
From the beautiful afar, I hear a voice that sounds like morning light bathed in the silver dew. Hear a voice and the alluring road that's ahead makes my head spin just like carousels used to. The beautiful afar, oh please do not break my heart, oh please do not break my heart, oh my heart, do not break. How from an honest start to the beautiful afar, to the beautiful afar, I begin to make my way. From the beautiful afar, I hear a voice, and it is calling me towards an earthly place. Hear a voice, and there's an answer that it demands. For tomorrow, oh, what have I done today? The beautiful afar, oh please do not break my heart, oh please do not break my heart, oh my heart, do not break. Oh, from an honest start to the beautiful afar, to the beautiful afar, I begin to make my way. I swear that I will grow kinder and more honest, and will never leave a friend in times of dread. Hear a voice and I rush towards what is promised, on a road on which no one has ever tread.